My name is Rosalind. I am 34 years old, and my family uninvited me to my sister's wedding after I paid over $135,000 for it. Yes, you heard that number correctly. $135,000 of my own hard-earned money, gone into a bottomless pit of family entitlement. Before I tell you exactly how I burned their entire fantasy to the ground in a single night, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Grab a warm blanket, pour yourself a large cup of coffee or a glass of wine, and get comfortable, because you are going to need it for this story. It is a long one, and it gets incredibly infuriating before it gets satisfying. It all started on a crisp Tuesday morning in the middle of November. I remember the exact chill in the air when I stepped out of my car in the corporate parking garage. The wind was biting, carrying the sharp scent of dead leaves and cold asphalt. I pulled my tailored navy blue wool coat tighter around my shoulders. I was exhausted. I had been surviving on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night for the past 3 weeks. But I was also incredibly proud. Today was the day of my quarterly review with the executive board. I had recently received a massive promotion at my firm. That promotion came with a significant increase in my salary, a corner office with a beautiful view of the city skyline, and a whole lot of pressure. I walked into the grand conference room on the 50th floor. The room was intimidating. The walls were lined with thick, soundproof frosted glass. The long table was carved from a single piece of dark, polished mahogany. The air conditioning was blowing a steady, freezing stream of air onto my shoulders, making me wish I had worn a thicker blouse under my blazer. I stood at the front of the room. I spent the first 20 minutes clicking through my presentation. I was pointing the red laser at the upward trajectory of our sales graph. I was explaining our market expansion strategy in great detail. I talked about consumer demographics, projected revenue streams, and risk management protocols. The room was dead silent except for the low hum of the projector fan and the quiet, rhythmic scratching of expensive fountain pens on legal pads. I felt confident. I felt like the years of grueling hard work were finally paying off. I was respected here. Then, the disruption started. My mobile phone, which was absolutely supposed to be on silent mode, started buzzing. It was sitting right there on the polished mahogany table, right next to the chief executive officer's elbow. One loud buzz. The sound vibrated against the wood like a tiny jackhammer. I ignored it. I forced my voice to remain steady. I kept my eyes locked on the executives, smoothly transitioning to my next talking point about our annual advertising budget. I figured it was just an automated email from the Human Resources Department or a calendar reminder for a lunch meeting. A second buzz. Then a third. A fourth. It simply did not stop. The vibration was incredibly loud in that quiet, serious room. The chief executive officer paused his writing. He slowly lowered his gold pen and looked up at me. Then, every single head in the room turned to look at me. There were 12 high-level executives staring directly at my face. The silence became thick, heavy, and extremely uncomfortable. I felt a hot, embarrassing flush crawl up my neck and spread across my cheeks. My heart started to race. I mumbled a quick, breathless apology to the board members. I picked up the phone, avoiding eye contact with the chief executive officer, and stepped out into the hallway. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, instantly muting the sounds of the room. I leaned my back against the cold frosted glass wall. The hallway was completely empty, smelling faintly of lemon floor polish and expensive cologne. I looked down at my phone screen. It was brightly lit with notifications. There were 12 text messages in a row, all from my mother, sent rapidly one after another. I swiped my thumb across the glass to unlock the device. My hands were shaking slightly. Usually, a string of texts like this meant someone was in the hospital or there had been a terrible car accident. I opened the message thread. I read through the frantic, disjointed sentences. My mother was rambling about seating charts, about how stressed my sister was, and about how they needed to make some difficult decisions regarding the guest list. and then I saw the last message. The last message was typed entirely in capital letters. You are not invited. Clementine does not want you there. My blood ran completely cold. I felt a sudden, sickening drop in my stomach, exactly like the feeling of missing a step on a dark staircase. I read the words again. Then I read them a third time. It simply did not make sense. I stared at the bright white screen until the black letters began to blur together into meaningless shapes. I was paying for the venue. I had paid for the expensive French caterer. I had paid for the 10-piece live band. I had paid for the ridiculous 5-tier vanilla bean cake that my sister Clementine absolutely had to have. I had spent the last 6 months of my life coordinating with demanding florists, arguing with difficult wedding planners, writing massive checks, and ensuring every single minor detail was perfect for her special day. And now, I was not invited. I stood in that empty corporate hallway for what felt like an absolute eternity. The lemon polish smell suddenly made me feel nauseous. I waited for the tears to come. Women our age know that familiar, stinging sensation behind the eyes when a loved one deeply betrays you. I fully expected to break down crying right there on the carpet. I expected the familiar sting of rejection that usually followed my family's casual cruelty. I expected to feel the desperate urge to call my mother and ask what I had done wrong. But the tears never came. Instead, something entirely different happened inside of me. I felt a strange, chilling calm wash over my entire body. It was the kind of dead, silent calm you feel when you are standing directly in the eye of a massive hurricane. The chaotic noise of my anxiety just stopped. The desperate, lifelong need to be loved by them, the endless, exhausting cycle of trying to buy their affection and prove my worth, it all just evaporated into the cold conditioned air of the office building. I looked at the text message again. Clementine does not want you there. I did not text my mother back. I did not call her to beg for an explanation. I did not call my sister to plead my case or loudly remind her of everything I had done for her. I did not type out a long, emotional paragraph about how much they were hurting me. I took a slow, deep breath. The cold air filled my lungs, making me feel grounded and solid. I opened the email application on my phone. I used the search bar to find the long email thread with the main venue manager. His name was David. He was a very polite, highly organized man who always responded within 5 minutes. I tapped the reply button on our most recent conversation. I typed a single, highly professional sentence into the subject line. Subject, cancellation. I did not hesitate for a single second. My fingers flew across the small digital keyboard with absolute, mechanical precision. David, regarding the upcoming wedding of Clementine. Please cancel all services, catering orders, and venue reservations booked under my name and paid for by my credit cards. This cancellation is effective immediately. Do not process any further payments. Thank you for your time and assistance. I read the email once to check for typos. It was completely flawless. I pressed the blue arrow icon. Send. One major piece down. I locked my phone and tucked it back into the front pocket of my blazer. I smoothed down the lapels of my navy suit. I adjusted my posture, rolling my shoulders back and standing up perfectly straight. I felt different. I felt lighter than I had in years. I placed my hand on the heavy brass handle of the boardroom door, pushed it open, and walked back in. My face was a perfect mask of corporate composure. I walked back to the front of the room, picked up the laser pointer, smiled politely at the chief executive officer, and resumed my presentation exactly where I had left off. The war had just begun, and I was going to win it. Driving home that evening, the reality of what I had just done finally started to sink in. The weather matched my internal mood perfectly. A heavy, relentless rain was falling over the city. The windshield wipers were slicing rhythmically back and forth across the glass, making a quiet, repetitive squeaking sound. The streetlights bled into long, blurry yellow streaks on the wet asphalt. I gripped the cold leather of the steering wheel. The heater was blasting warm air against my frozen feet, but I still felt a deep, internal chill. As I drove through the dark, flooded streets, my mind became a slideshow of memories. I could not stop thinking about how my family and I had arrived at this breaking point. The first memory that flashed vividly in my mind was from when I was 12 years old. I saw myself standing in the dark hallway of our old, drafty house. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. A major plumbing pipe had burst in the guest bathroom ceiling. The hallway carpet was completely soaked, squishing loudly under my bare feet and smelling strongly of dirty water and mildew. My mother was pacing in tight circles in the kitchen, crying frantically over her ruined rugs. She was completely paralyzed by the stress, incapable of making a simple phone call to fix the problem. I was the one who walked to the kitchen drawer, pulled out the heavy yellow phone book, and found a 24-hour emergency plumber. I stood in the cold puddle on the floor, shivering violently in my thin cotton pajamas, giving the gruff dispatcher our home address and calmly asking about their emergency service rates. Where was my sister Clementine during this crisis? She was safely locked in her bedroom, completely oblivious. She had her music blasting so loud I could hear the heavy bass thumping through the wet drywall. She did not come out a single time to help me grab old towels to soak up the mess. She simply ignored the chaos and let me handle it. Then the scene in my mind shifted. I was 16 years old, sitting at the scratched wooden kitchen table. It was the middle of winter, and the house was freezing cold. I was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, holding the plastic landline phone to my ear, listening to awful, static hold music for 45 minutes. I was secretly negotiating a payment plan with the electric company because my father had forgotten to pay the utility bill again. When the customer service representative finally answered the line, I had to lower my voice to a desperate whisper. I lied and told the woman I was the homeowner. I used the small amount of cash I had saved from my exhausting weekend job at the grocery store to keep the lights and heat on for my family. My father walked in 3 hours later, smelling strongly of cheap beer and stale cigarettes. He did not even notice that the house was warm again. He never asked how the lights miraculously came back on. Responsibility was never a choice for me. I never got to just be a carefree child who played with friends and worried about school dances. I was the unpaid manager of a household that absolutely refused to manage itself. I learned very early in life that if I did not fix a problem, no one else would. I wore my competence like a suit of heavy iron armor. It protected me from the daily chaos of my family, but it also isolated me from them. That heavy armor of responsibility eventually became my entire identity. It defined every single choice I made as I grew up. When it was time for college, I knew my parents would not contribute a single dime to my education. They had absolutely no savings. So, I built my own college fund from absolutely nothing. I worked 3 part-time jobs during my senior year of high school. I worked at a local bakery at 4 in the morning to prepare the bread, went to high school for 7 hours, and then worked as a waitress at a busy diner until midnight. I slept an average of 4 hours a night. I was constantly exhausted, running on caffeine and sheer willpower. My relentless drive paid off. I secured a full academic scholarship to a highly competitive university. I studied constantly. I did not go to parties. I did not take spring break trips. I graduated summa cum laude. By the time I walked across the stage to get my diploma, I already had a lucrative job offer waiting for me at a major firm. I remember looking out into the audience during the graduation ceremony. Most students had huge cheering sections of family members holding balloons and flowers. My parents were sitting in the very back row, looking bored and distracted. My starting salary right out of university was more money than my parents had ever made combined in a single year. I poured every ounce of my energy, my youth, and my passion into my career. I did not date anyone seriously. I did not take vacations. I just worked. I climbed the corporate ladder with a fierce determination. Years later, I took a massive risk and started my own technology company. When my tech startup eventually sold to a major international corporation, that same childhood competence made me a millionaire. I vividly remember the day the sale was finalized. I was sitting in the sleek, glass-walled office of my corporate lawyer. He was a sharp, older man with silver hair and a very serious demeanor. He pushed the final, massive buyout contract across the polished conference table toward me. He handed me a heavy, expensive gold pen. I took a deep breath, reading over the final numbers, and I signed my name on the dotted line. I set the pen down, looked out the large window at the bustling city below, and realized that just like that, my life had completely changed. I never had to worry about an electric bill being shut off ever again. I was financially safe forever. But that is exactly when the requests from my family started pouring in. The money did not bring congratulations or pride from my parents. It brought immense expectations. Suddenly, everyone in my family had a financial emergency, and I was the only emergency contact they ever called. The very first major request was a new car for my father. His rusty old truck finally broke down on the side of the highway. Instead of taking it to a local mechanic to see if it could be fixed, he immediately called me on my mobile phone. He did not ask how I was doing. He acted like my new financial success was some sort of family inheritance he had just been patiently waiting to collect. I agreed to help him because I felt guilty for having so much while they struggled. I drove him to the local car dealership on a sunny Saturday afternoon. I was planning to buy him a reliable, sensible used sedan. Something safe and economical. But the moment we walked onto the dealership lot, he ignored the used cars completely. He walked straight into the main indoor showroom and stood next to a brand new, fully loaded, luxury sports utility vehicle. I stood there, clutching my purse, watching him run his rough hands over the pristine cream leather seats and admire the glossy wooden dashboard. He looked at me with this expectant, entitled smile. I felt completely sick to my stomach, but I walked over to the salesman, pulled out my checkbook, and paid for the entire luxury vehicle in full. My father barely even thanked me. He just took the keys and drove away. Next came the demand for help with my mother's mortgage. Her hours at the retail store were cut back slightly. She invited me over for dinner, made my favorite roast chicken, and then sat at the dining table, crying softly into a paper tissue. She blamed her inability to work full shifts on the emotional stress of my Aunt Agnes's recent, incredibly messy divorce. My mother claimed she was just too depressed by the extended family drama to get out of bed and go to work. I sat there, listening to her ridiculous excuses, and I wrote a check that covered 6 entire months of her house payments. I even ended up paying for the expensive catering at my great-uncle's funeral later that same year. We were standing in the funeral home parking lot, dressed in black, and my mother loudly complained to the extended family that they could not afford to feed the guests after the service. Everyone stopped talking and looked directly at me. The silence was incredibly manipulative. So, I pulled out my credit card and paid the catering director thousands of dollars so my family would not be publicly embarrassed. Then came Clementine. My younger sister needed a massive security deposit after she completely trashed her last rented apartment. I had to personally meet her angry landlord in a unit that smelled terribly like stale smoke, rotting garbage, and wet dog. There were fist-sized holes punched in the drywall in the living room, and the kitchen cabinet doors were ripped entirely off their hinges. The landlord was threatening to call the police and press charges for property damage. I wrote another massive check right there on the dirty kitchen counter to keep the landlord from taking my sister to court. I never said no. I simply did not know how to set boundaries with them. I honestly, truly thought that by fixing all their problems, by being their ultimate financial savior, I was finally earning their genuine love. I thought that if I was useful enough, if I was generous enough, they would finally look at me and see a beloved daughter and a cherished sister, instead of a walking automated teller machine. So, knowing all of this painful history, you can probably understand why my first instinct was not suspicion when Clementine called me at midnight on a Tuesday. I was dead asleep in my apartment. The room was pitch black. I fumbled blindly for my phone on the wooden nightstand, accidentally knocking over a glass of water in the process. The bright screen burned my tired eyes. I answered the call, my voice groggy and thick with sleep. He proposed. Desmond finally proposed to me. Clementine screamed right into the speaker. Her voice was shrill and completely breathless with excitement. Desmond was a guy who had spent the last 4 years jumping from one entry-level job to another. He was always complaining about his bosses, always quitting when things got slightly difficult, and always waiting for some phantom promotion that never seemed to materialize. He was incredibly lazy. But Clementine absolutely adored him, and deep down, despite everything she put me through, I just wanted my little sister to be happy. "That is wonderful news, Clem," I said, sitting up in bed and rubbing my tired eyes. My brain, trained by decades of habit, immediately shifted into problem-solving mode. "Congratulations to both of you. How can I help?" She laughed over the phone. It was a light, airy, innocent sound that completely disguised the massive financial trap she was carefully setting for me. "Oh, Rosalind, just small stuff," she chirped sweetly over the phone. "Maybe you could just help us figure out a few of the initial deposits to hold our dates with the vendors. Nothing crazy at all. Just to get the ball rolling." I smiled in the dark bedroom. "Small stuff. A deposit for a local photographer, maybe booking a modest church hall. I could handle that." It felt genuinely nice to be included in her joy. "Of course," I said warmly. "Whatever you need to make your day special." Exactly 2 weeks later, Clementine and my mother arrived at my apartment. We sat down in my spacious living room. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large windows, casting warm, golden light across the hardwood floor. I went into the kitchen, ground some fresh coffee beans, and poured 3 steaming cups of dark roast coffee. I set the mugs down on the glass coffee table, along with a plate of assorted cookies. Clementine sat on the plush sofa, pulled a sleek silver laptop from her canvas tote bag, opened it, and confidently turned the bright screen toward me. It was a spreadsheet. But it did not look like a simple, traditional wedding budget. It looked exactly like a highly detailed, complex corporate financial proposal. There were dozens of color-coded tabs running along the bottom of the screen. Elaborate floral arrangements. Live entertainment and custom staging. Hand-beaded designer gowns and multiple dress alterations. A premium, top-tier open bar featuring imported liquors. Luxury transportation including 2 vintage vehicles. I scrolled the computer mouse down to the bottom line of the summary page. The final estimated total was highlighted in bold, bright red text. $135,000. My stomach dropped so fast I actually felt dizzy. I set my coffee mug down on the glass table so hard that the dark liquid splashed over the ceramic rim and stained the coaster. I stared at the glowing screen, my mouth hanging slightly open in absolute shock. "Clementine," I said, my voice incredibly tight. "This is a massive amount of money. Are you and Desmond taking out a bank loan to pay for this?" Clementine looked away from the screen, tracing the rim of her coffee mug with her index finger. She refused to make eye contact with me. "Desmond's parents might help a little bit with the rehearsal dinner," she said vaguely, waving her hand in the air as if dismissing a minor detail. But her eyes, and my mother's eyes, were not looking at the spreadsheet anymore. They were locked entirely on me. They stared at me with that heavy, familiar, expectant silence I had known my entire life. It was a silent, suffocating demand. My mother reached across the glass table and patted my knee with her soft, manicured hand. "Do not worry about the logistics, girls. We will figure it out," she said softly, flashing a tight smile at me. "In my family, 'we will figure it out' was the universal code phrase for Rosalind is going to pay for it entirely." I looked at Clementine's eager, shining face. I looked at my mother's expectant smile. I felt a familiar, crushing weight settle onto my shoulders, heavy as lead. I sighed deeply, opened the drawer of the wooden side table, and pulled out my checkbook. The next 6 months of my life were an absolute, exhausting blur of wire transfers, massive credit card authorizations, and frustrating vendor meetings. I was managing a highly complicated corporate merger at work, routinely working 10 to 12-hour days. But during every single lunch break, during every evening sitting alone in my apartment, I was managing my sister's extravagant, ever-changing fantasy wedding. There were rush deposits for florists because Clementine kept changing her mind on a weekly basis. One week she demanded imported white orchids directly from Hawaii. The next week, she decided orchids were too common and demanded rare blue hydrangeas, which cost double the original price. I paid a massive, completely non-refundable down payment on a custom designer wedding dress that cost significantly more than my very first automobile. I signed a strict, legally binding retainer contract for a 10-piece live jazz band that was hired solely because they knew how to play exactly one obscure jazz song that Desmond liked. Because I am a deeply organized person, I tracked every single penny that left my bank account. I created a meticulously organized folder on my laptop desktop. I named the folder Clementine Wedding Expenses. Every time I dragged a new digital invoice or a scanned catering receipt into that folder, I felt a tiny, sharp pinch of bitter resentment in my chest. But that resentment was always followed immediately by a heavy, suffocating wave of familiar guilt. I told myself I was being selfish for caring about the money. I told myself this is what good, supportive sisters do for their family. Around this same time, one of my senior employees was going through a terrible, heartbreaking custody battle over her 2 young children. She was coming into the office every morning with dark, heavy circles under her eyes, frequently crying quietly in the employee break room. I sat her down in my office, helped her find an aggressive, highly rated family lawyer, and gave her 3 weeks of fully paid time off so she could attend all her stressful court hearings without losing her salary. Watching her struggle, and seeing how incredibly grateful she was for my emotional and financial support, made me realize something deeply uncomfortable. I took significantly better care of the strangers who worked for my company than my own flesh and blood family took care of me. But I pushed the painful thought away, burying it under another large pile of wedding invoices and seating charts. I honestly, truly believed that this grand financial gesture, this massive personal sacrifice, would finally earn me a real, permanent seat at the family table. I thought that when the wedding day finally arrived, my mother would look at me with genuine pride and affection. I thought Clementine would finally hug me tightly, look me directly in the eyes, and thank me sincerely for always taking care of her when absolutely no one else would. Instead, as the wedding date grew closer and the bills grew larger, I found myself being systematically and quietly pushed out of the entire planning process. It started with very small, seemingly subtle things. One afternoon, I was sitting alone in my office eating a sad desk salad for lunch. I was mindlessly scrolling through my social media feed on my phone to clear my head for a few minutes. A photo popped up on my timeline. It was a picture of my mother, Clementine, and 3 of her bridesmaids. They were sitting in a fancy, pastel-colored bakery downtown, holding up elegant crystal glasses of expensive pink champagne. They were all laughing enthusiastically. The caption under the photo read, "Finding the perfect cake for my perfect girl. Best day ever." I stopped chewing my food. I carefully placed my plastic fork down on the desk. I was finding out about the wedding cake tastings from my mother's public social media posts. No one had even called to tell me they were going. No one had invited me to join them. The most painful part of the entire situation? I was the one who had physically signed the contract and paid the $5,000 deposit to that exact bakery just the week before. I paid for the luxurious cake they were happily eating, and I was not even deemed important enough to be invited to taste it. A few days later, my phone buzzed with a different kind of notification. I looked down at the screen and saw a system message from my messaging application. I had been formally removed from the Bridal Brigade group chat. I stared at the screen, a cold, hard knot forming in the center of my chest. My breathing became shallow. I called Clementine immediately. The phone rang 3 times and went straight to her voicemail. 10 minutes later, she did not call me back. Instead, she left a clipped, highly annoyed audio message. "Hey Rosalind," her voice crackled through the phone speaker, sounding entirely unapologetic and rushed. "I took you out of the group chat because it was getting way too cluttered with vendor talk and boring minor details. You were just so busy with your corporate work all the time, I really did not want your phone blowing up all day and distracting you. We will talk later. Bye." It was a blatant, insulting lie. I knew for a fact it was a lie. The group chat was not filled with boring vendor talk or logistical details. It was entirely composed of funny inside jokes, bachelorette party planning, outfit discussions, and gossip about the groomsmen. They were planning all the fun parts of the wedding, and they explicitly did not want me there. I sat completely alone in my quiet, dark apartment that night. The bright screen of my laptop was glowing brightly in the dim light of the room, illuminating the folder titled Clementine Wedding Expenses. I looked at that digital folder, filled with dozens of receipts that I had paid with my own hard-earned money, and I finally realized the painful, undeniable truth of my existence within my family. I was good enough to fund the expensive party. I was good enough to work long hours, to carry the stress, and to pay the massive bills. But I was not good enough, and I was never going to be good enough, to actually be considered a real part of my own family. The final straw, the single event that finally cracked my heavy iron armor, happened on a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished a long meeting regarding my recent promotion at the corporate office. The weather was unusually warm for that time of year, and the sun was shining brightly through my windshield as I drove across town. I had decided to stop by the upscale floral boutique during my lunch hour. I needed to pay the final balance for the wedding flowers in person. The florist had requested a physical check for the remaining amount, and I wanted to make sure everything was perfectly handled. I parked my car on the street and walked up to the charming storefront. The shop was located in a very expensive part of the city. It had large glass windows displaying elaborate arrangements of white roses and green vines. I pushed open the heavy wooden door. A small brass bell chimed brightly above my head, announcing my arrival. The inside of the shop smelled incredibly strong. It was a thick, overwhelming mixture of sweet lilies, sharp eucalyptus, and damp potting soil. The front counter was completely empty. I stood there for a moment, holding my leather purse with both hands. I looked around at the buckets of fresh flowers sitting on the tiled floor. Then, I heard a voice. It was coming from the back office, behind a partially closed door. It was Clementine. My heart did a little jump. I smiled, thinking it would be a nice surprise to see her. I took a step forward, raising my hand to knock on the open door frame. But before my knuckles could touch the wood, I heard exactly what she was saying. She was on a phone call. Her voice was not the sweet, innocent chirp she used when she asked me for money. Her voice was dripping with heavy, unmistakable annoyance. I know, Clementine said loudly, sighing heavily into the phone. She was talking to one of her bridesmaids. God, she just makes everything about her. It is exhausting. I froze completely. My hand hovered in the air. My smile vanished. There was a brief pause as the person on the other end of the line spoke. Then Clementine let out a sharp, cruel laugh. Exactly, she continued. This is my wedding day. It is supposed to be about me and Desmond. It is not her latest corporate business acquisition. She is constantly asking for updates on the invoices. She acts like she is my boss. I stopped breathing. The air in my lungs felt trapped. I could not move my feet. I stood there, hidden behind a large display of ferns, listening to my own sister tear me apart. Honestly, Clementine said, her voice dropping lower, sounding deeply resentful. I just wish she would send the money and stay completely out of it. We do not even want her at the rehearsal dinner. She is just going to sit there and judge everyone. She is so stiff and boring. Those words felt like a physical punch directly to my stomach. All the air violently left my lungs. The bright, colorful flower shop suddenly felt dark and suffocating. I did not step forward. I did not yell. I quietly turned around, gently pulled the heavy wooden door open so the brass bell would not chime again, and walked back out onto the busy sidewalk. I walked all the way to my car, got inside, locked the doors, and gripped the steering wheel. I sat there in the silence, staring blindly at the traffic passing by. The hurt was so incredibly sharp and deep that it was no longer just emotional. It was a severe physical pain radiating through my chest. That night, I did not sleep for a single second. I returned to my quiet apartment, took off my coat, and sat down on my living room sofa in complete darkness. The city lights flickered dimly through the large windows, casting long, strange shadows across the floor. I sat there for hours, perfectly still. I replayed Clementine's harsh, cruel words over and over again in my mind. I just wished she would send the money and stay completely out of it. For my entire adult life, I had desperately tried to buy my way into my family's heart. I had sacrificed my own happiness, my own peace of mind, and a massive amount of my hard-earned salary. I had given up so much just to be useful to them. I thought my financial support was a bridge connecting us. But sitting in the dark, the painful truth finally washed over me. The heavy fog of my desperate hope lifted. Underneath the deep hurt, something else was slowly beginning to stir. It was a cold, hard, brilliant clarity. This was not love. This had never been love. This was a business transaction. I was not a cherished sister or a beloved daughter. I was a free bank. I was a limitless college fund that never asked for grades. I was the emergency lawyer when things went wrong. I was the one who funded their lifestyle, and they resented me for it because my competence reminded them of their own failures. I had been a complete fool to think otherwise. But I am not a woman who stays a fool for long. I am a highly successful corporate executive. I deal with difficult, manipulative people for a living. I decided right then and there, sitting in the dark at 3 a.m, that I would not just call them and cry. I would not just quietly pull my money and let them play the victim. My entire strategy shifted. The sad, rejected sister died in that living room. The ruthless chief executive officer woke up. I was no longer a family member trying to help. I was an executive conducting strict due diligence on a terrible, toxic investment. I turned on a single table lamp. I walked over to my desk, opened my laptop, and began to work. I started meticulously documenting everything. I took detailed screenshots of every passive-aggressive text message my mother had sent me over the past 6 months. I took screenshots of Clementine ignoring my questions while simultaneously posting pictures of her expensive shopping trips on social media. Then, I created a brand new, secure email account. I spent the next 4 hours carefully forwarding every single wedding invoice, every contract, every catering receipt, and every signed vendor agreement to that separate email account. I built an undeniable, rock-solid case file. I was going to let them build their entire beautiful fantasy world on my financial foundation. And then, at the absolute perfect moment, I was going to pull that foundation right out from under their feet. The final, missing piece of the puzzle fell into place 2 days later during a routine phone call. I was sitting at my office desk, reviewing the final details for the upcoming rehearsal dinner. I needed to confirm a minor detail about the vegetarian meal options with the main caterer. Her name was Marjorie. Marjorie was a lovely, older woman who ran a very prestigious catering company in the city. I picked up my desk phone and dialed her direct office number. Marjorie answered on the second ring. "Good afternoon, Marjorie speaking," she said cheerfully. "Hello Marjorie, this is Rosalind," I said, keeping my voice light and professional. "I am just calling to confirm the dietary restrictions for the rehearsal dinner next Friday. I want to make sure the vegetarian plates are completely finalized." "Oh, Rosalind," Marjorie said. Her cheerful tone instantly dropped. There was a very long, highly awkward silence on the other end of the line. I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Is something wrong with the menu?" I asked, frowning slightly at my computer screen. No, the menu is perfectly fine, dear, Marjorie said in a gentle, highly hesitant voice. She sounded like she was talking to a fragile child. It is just. Well, your mother called me last week. She gave us very strict instructions to only contact her directly moving forward. I sat up straight in my leather office chair. Did she give a reason for that change? I asked slowly. Marjorie sighed softly. Oh honey, I hate to even bring it up. She told us that you were going through a very difficult patch with your mental health. She said you were experiencing a severe emotional breakdown due to stress at work, and that we should absolutely not bother you with any wedding details. She said they were trying to give you space to heal in peace. A difficult patch. A severe emotional breakdown. I closed my eyes. My hands tightened into tight fists on my desk. The phrase was so perfectly vague, so incredibly manipulative. It painted my mother as a caring, protective parent shielding her sick daughter from stress. They were not just using my money. They were actively assassinating my character to all of the vendors and guests. They were spreading terrible lies about my mental health to explain my sudden absence from the planning process. An absence that they themselves had intentionally engineered. They wanted the money, but they did not want the embarrassment of having the stiff and boring sister around. So, they made me sound crazy. The rage inside of me boiled hot and fast, running through my veins like fire. But I forced my voice to remain perfectly steadied and calm. I see, I said smoothly into the phone. Thank you for letting me know, Marjorie. My mother is just very protective. But I assure you, I am perfectly fine, and the final payment will come directly from my account as planned. Oh, that is wonderful to hear, dear, Marjorie said, sounding incredibly relieved. I thanked her and gently placed the phone back on the receiver. That was it. That was the final nail in their coffin. I had my complete case. I had the financial motive, I had the means, and I had the undeniable evidence of their cruelty and lies. All I needed now was the perfect stage to present it. The perfect moment finally arrived at the rehearsal dinner. The event was held at a ridiculously expensive, exclusive restaurant located on the top floor of a skyscraper overlooking the entire city. The room had floor-to-ceiling glass windows offering a breathtaking view of the sparkling skyline. It was a place I had personally researched, booked, and paid for months in advance. I arrived exactly on time. I wore a stunning, emerald green silk dress that made me look completely untouchable. I walked into the private dining room. The air was incredibly thick with fake, high-pitched laughter and the constant clinking of expensive crystal champagne glasses. The moment I stepped through the double doors, the energy in the room shifted. My family immediately began giving me the cold shoulder. My mother looked at me, her eyes widening in slight panic, before quickly turning her back to me. Clementine pretended she was too busy laughing at a joke one of her bridesmaids told to even acknowledge my arrival. They acted as if my physical presence in the room I paid for was a strange, unfortunate inconvenience. I did not let it bother me. I walked to the bar, ordered a glass of sparkling water with a lime, and stood quietly near the large windows, simply observing the room. I watched Desmond, the groom, loudly bragging to his friends about a promotion he had not even officially received yet. I watched my father ordering his third glass of top-shelf whiskey on my tab. About an hour into the evening, the guests began taking their seats for dinner. I was placed at the very end of the long family table, as far away from the bride and groom as physically possible. I sat down gracefully, placing my linen napkin in my lap. My mother was seated near the center of the table, directly next to Desmond's mother, the very elegant and highly composed Mrs. Sterling. Mrs. Sterling was a wealthy woman who intimidated my mother deeply. During the salad course, my mother leaned over to Mrs. Sterling. The restaurant was loud, so my mother had to raise her voice. She spoke loudly enough for several people, including myself, to hear her clearly. We are just so incredibly glad Rosalind could make it tonight, even if just for a little while, my mother said, gesturing vaguely in my direction with her fork. She put on a deeply tragic, sympathetic face. She has been under so much severe stress lately. We just worry about her mental state so much. But family is family, right? Mrs. Sterling looked at me with a mixture of polite pity and mild discomfort. Yes, of course. Health must always come first, Mrs. Sterling replied smoothly. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I did not break eye contact with my mother. She quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in her cherry tomatoes. I smiled. The trap was set. They were sitting right in the middle of it. When the main courses were cleared away and the dessert plates were set down, it was time for the traditional toasts. I sat quietly in my chair at the end of the table and let them all go first. I watched my father stand up, his face flushed from the whiskey, and give a rambling speech about how proud he was of Clementine. I listened to my mother cry fake tears while she talked about how beautiful her youngest daughter looked. I endured the maid of honor spouting sentimental, cliched nonsense about soulmates and true love. Every single speech praised Clementine and Desmond. Not a single person mentioned me. Not a single person thanked me for providing the room, the food, or the drinks they were currently consuming. When the maid of honor finally sat down, a quiet lull fell over the room. I placed my linen napkin on the table. I picked up my crystal water glass. I stood up slowly. The fabric of my emerald dress rustled quietly. I took a small silver spoon and tapped it lightly against the side of my glass. Clink. 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 The sound cut through the low chatter of the room like a sharp knife. Everyone slowly turned their heads to look at me. The room fell completely silent. I could see the sudden, sharp panic flash in my mother's eyes. Clementine's smile became tight and frozen. I smiled back at them. It was a wide, serene, perfectly practiced corporate smile. It was the smile I used right before I fired someone for gross misconduct. I would like to say a few words, I began. My voice was completely clear, steady, and projected easily to the back of the room. I did not shake. I did not stutter. I was in complete control. I looked directly at the happy couple. Clementine. Desmond. I wish you nothing but the absolute best in your future together. I paused. I let the false warmth of that statement hang heavy in the air for a full 3 seconds. I watched the tension in my mother's shoulders drop slightly. She thought I was going to play along. She thought I was going to be the obedient, silent bank. Then, I shattered the illusion completely. And I know, I continued, my voice dropping an octave, becoming colder and sharper. I know exactly how much intense effort and planning goes into creating a perfect wedding day. The financial burden can be incredibly overwhelming for a young couple just starting out. A confused murmur went through the room. Guests looked at each other, not quite understanding where I was going with this. My father's drunken smile faltered and slowly slid off his face. For instance, I said, gesturing broadly with my free hand to the beautiful surroundings. Take this absolutely stunning private dining room overlooking our great city. The deposit alone was a small price at $18,500. The murmur stopped instantly. The silence became thick and highly uncomfortable. Desmond swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. And the exquisite 5-course meal you are all currently enjoying, I continued, my voice perfectly even, pacing my words like a judge reading a final verdict. Paired perfectly with imported French wine. That was an absolute steal at $26,000. Someone near the back of the room gasped softly. My mother's face began to turn a sickly shade of gray. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I turned my head and looked directly into Clementine's eyes. Her face was rapidly turning pale, all the color draining from her cheeks. And Clementine, I said softly, but the entire room heard me. That stunning, custom-designed Vera Wang wedding gown you will be wearing tomorrow afternoon. All $10,500 of it looked absolutely beautiful in the photos I saw posted online. Since I was not invited to the dress fitting, I had to rely on social media to see what my money purchased. The silence in the room was now absolute. You could hear a pin drop on the carpet. The guests were completely frozen, their forks hovering halfway to their mouths. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, heavy with the weight of the massive numbers I was dropping onto the table. I was publicly blowing up their spot, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop me. If you have made it this far into my story, please do me a quick favor, like this video and comment the number 1 down below. It lets me know how awesome you are and shows that you are right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement and truly motivates me to share these difficult experiences. Drop that one in the comments so I can recognize you, and now, let us get back to the final destruction of this wedding. I did not stop there. I lowered my glass and turned my full, undivided attention to the groom's mother. I looked directly at Mrs. Sterling. I softened my facial expression into one of deep, highly sincere concern. I played my role perfectly. And I have to say, Mrs. Sterling, I said, my voice dripping with false gratitude. I want to personally thank you for your incredible understanding and patience this evening. Mrs. Sterling looked completely bewildered. She glanced nervously at my mother, then back at me. Understanding regarding what, dear? She asked hesitantly. Well, I said, placing my hand over my heart. I am just so incredibly relieved that I was able to fully recover from that recent, highly severe mental instability my family told you and the catering staff all about. It was truly a difficult patch. I paused, letting the words sink into the quiet room. My mother closed her eyes tightly, looking like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Honestly, I continued, flashing a brilliant, sharp smile at the entire room. It is an absolute miracle that I am even lucid enough tonight to stand here and pay this final restaurant bill. But mental health is just so very important, is it not? The color completely drained from Mrs. Sterling's face as she realized exactly what my mother had done. She looked at my mother with absolute, undeniable disgust. Clementine looked like she had just been physically slapped across the face. She was trembling, gripping the edge of the tablecloth with white knuckles. The carefully constructed, incredibly expensive fantasy world my family had built on my back had just imploded in spectacular fashion. And I was the one standing there, proudly holding the detonator. In the chaotic murmuring that immediately followed my speech, I quietly placed my crystal glass down on the table. I picked up my small clutch purse, turned my back on the entire room, and walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the exit. I kept my head held high. I was halfway down the long hallway leading to the elevators when I heard frantic footsteps running behind me. Rosalind! Stop right now. I stopped, but I did not turn around immediately. I slowly pivoted on my heels. My mother and Clementine had caught up to me. They were standing by the heavy wooden doors, their faces completely contorted with a mixture of intense rage, deep panic, and profound embarrassment. How could you possibly do this to me? Clementine hissed violently, angry tears of fury welling up in her eyes. She pointed a shaking finger at my face. You ruined everything. You ruined my rehearsal dinner. You are a monster. My mother stepped forward, her hands shaking. You embarrassed us in front of Desmond's entire family. How are we supposed to fix this? I looked at the two of them. I looked at the tears streaming down my sister's face. I looked at the panic in my mother's eyes. For the very first time in my entire 34 years of life, I felt absolutely no pity for them. I felt no suffocating guilt. I felt no heavy, crushing sense of familial obligation. I just felt a profound, beautiful, incredibly liberating emptiness. No, Clementine, I said. My voice was very quiet, but it was as firm and hard as solid steel. I did not ruin anything. I gave you the exact wedding of your dreams. Every single expensive, ridiculous detail. I paid for it all. I took one step closer to her, looking directly into her weeping eyes. Consider my permanent absence from your life, starting right this very second, to be my second wedding gift to you. We are completely done. I did not wait for a response. I turned around, pressed the elevator button, stepped inside the empty car, and let the shiny metal doors close on their shocked faces. I walked out of the building and into the cool, refreshing night air. I was leaving them standing in the doorway of the luxurious life I had fully paid for, a life I was no longer welcome in. And as I drove away from the restaurant, I did not look in the rearview mirror a single time. A full year passed after that explosive night. It was the quietest, most peaceful year of my entire life. The first thing I did was hire a highly recommended therapist. I spent months sitting on a comfortable leather couch, crying, talking, and slowly learning how to untangle my own self-worth from my financial utility to other people. It was incredibly hard, exhausting work. I had to learn that saying the word no did not make me a terrible person. I had to learn that my bank account balance was not the only interesting thing about me. I set completely impenetrable boundaries. I blocked my mother's phone number. I blocked my father's phone number. I blocked Clementine on every single social media platform and email account I possessed. 6 months into my healing journey, I decided to take a vacation. A real vacation, just for myself. I rented a small, beautiful cabin on the rocky coast of Maine. The day I arrived, I walked out onto the wooden deck, listened to the loud crashing of the ocean waves against the stones, and I turned my mobile phone completely off. I took the phone and shoved it into the bottom of my travel bag. Metaphorically speaking, I threw it right into the ocean. I just existed for a full week. I drank hot tea on the porch. I read fiction novels. I walked on the cold sand. I did not check a single corporate email. I did not worry about anyone else's emergencies. It was absolute, pure bliss. I returned to the city feeling like a completely different woman. The heavy iron armor I had worn since childhood was finally gone. Then, one rainy afternoon, exactly 13 months after the rehearsal dinner, I walked to my mailbox in the apartment lobby. Nestled between the utility bills and the junk mail was a small, white envelope. It was a real letter, with a physical stamp. I immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Clementine. I stood in the lobby for a long time, holding the envelope. My heart beat a little faster, but the old, suffocating panic was not there anymore. I took the elevator up to my apartment, sat down at my kitchen counter, and carefully sliced the envelope open with a knife. Inside was a single, plain white card. There was no long, manipulative paragraph. There were no excuses. There were only 7 words written in a messy, slightly shaky hand. Can we please talk? I am sorry. I did not reply immediately. I waited 2 full weeks, discussing it thoroughly with my therapist, before I finally sent her a short text message agreeing to meet. We met at a very neutral, quiet coffee shop on the opposite side of the city. I arrived first and sat at a small table by the window. When Clementine walked through the door, I barely recognized her. She looked significantly smaller. She was wearing a plain gray sweater and jeans. The entitled, arrogant sparkle that used to always dance in her eyes was completely gone. It was replaced by a deep, weary exhaustion that aged her face by 10 years. She sat down across from me. She ordered a black coffee and stared into the dark liquid for a long time before she finally spoke. She told me absolutely everything. The expensive, luxurious wedding never happened. After my dramatic exit at the rehearsal dinner, the situation rapidly spiraled completely out of control. Mrs. Sterling, appalled by my mother's vicious lies about my mental health and disgusted by the family's blatant financial exploitation, had a massive argument with my parents. The shame and the public embarrassment had been too much. The Sterling family pulled their support. But worse than that, the intense public humiliation had forced Clementine to finally look in a mirror. Really look at herself, for the very first time in her pampered life. She told me she was currently in intensive weekly therapy. She also told me she was currently going through a very messy divorce. She and Desmond had quietly gone to a courthouse to get married a month after the cancelled wedding, but the relationship had completely crumbled under the weight of real-world responsibilities. Desmond still refused to keep a steady job, and without my money to bail them out, they lost their apartment. It was not entirely Desmond's fault, Clementine admitted softly, her voice cracking slightly as she stared into her cold coffee cup. She finally looked up and met my eyes. I built my entire identity, my entire life, around what other people thought of me. I wanted the expensive dress and the fancy venue to prove I was important. It was all just a fragile house of cards. She reached across the table, not to ask for money, but just to rest her hand near mine. You just had the guts to be the one to finally blow that house down, she said. And honestly, Rosalind, I needed you to do it. I looked at my younger sister. I did not immediately offer to pay for her divorce lawyer. I did not offer her a place to stay in my apartment. The urge to fix her life was gone. It was not immediate forgiveness. Not yet. Too much damage had been done for a simple coffee date to fix everything. But it was a start. It was, for the first time in our lives, the actual truth. Today, my life is incredibly different. My dining room table is not filled with toxic family members who only pretend to love me when they need my credit card. My table is filled with mismatched chairs and wonderful, supportive friends who do not need absolutely anything from me except my company and my conversation. I also spend my weekends volunteering. I mentor young female entrepreneurs, helping them navigate the corporate world and build their business dreams on their own terms. Last week, one of the young women I mentor sent me a handwritten note. The note said, "Rosalind, you taught me that I am never the backup plan. I am the blueprint." For years, I gave my place away at the table and called it love. Now, I know the truth. The most valuable table in the world is not the one you are desperately invited to. It is the one you build yourself. She was absolutely right. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It was not an easy journey to share with all of you, but I felt it was incredibly important. Setting boundaries with family is the hardest thing you will ever do, but it is also the most necessary. My question for all of you watching is this: have you ever had to make the difficult choice between keeping your toxic family happy and preserving your own self-worth? What exactly did you do? Let me know your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again, and remember, always build your own table.